Hi, welcome to another edition of Governance Watch, our webcast. And this time we have a special guest with us. I'm Doug Cha, the Executive Director of the Governance Center here at the Conference Board. And our special guest today is Dr. Richard Leblanc. Dr. Richard Leblanc is the Director of the Masters of Financial Accountability Program and an Associate Professor of Law, Governance, and Ethics at York University in Canada. And so thank you for being with us. Richard has recently put out a book called The Handbook of Board Governance, which is one of probably only two comprehensive books of its type dedicated to corporate governance. And so, Richard, thanks for being here. Thanks for coming down to New York. I really appreciate it. Let's just, we're going to talk a little bit about the book and also get into some corporate governance discussion as well, of course. So let's just start with the book. What prompted you to put this book together?
It's a tough field and it's changing. And my vision for the book was originally that I would write it, but then I just was quickly overwhelmed and I thought, cybersecurity, climate change, executive pay, directors and officers of insurance. There's so many topics where I'm not a subject matter expert. I got the idea, why don't I edit a book and have people globally that have much more expertise in these narrow topics than I do, and put together a compendium, if you will, of I guess it's 30 or 40 chapters, and so directors can sort of pick and choose what they want to look at. So that was the sort of vision for the book. Yeah.
Got it. Well, it's called the Handbook of Corporate Governance, and as we can see, it's 800 pages plus. I think the table of contents is 13 pages on its own, and so for handbook, you must have very strong hands.
Yeah,
because,
it's a weighty.
But so anyway, so given that it's not kind of your traditional handbook that you're keeping in your chest pocket, how do you suggest readers go through this book? Obviously, they're not going to read it from cover to cover in one sitting. So
you pick and choose what chapters that you want some sort of updating on. It's all inclusive. I don't think there's anything that's relevant to the field of corporate governance that's not already in the book. So you pick and choose. I mean, you're clearly not going to read it. You would use it as a resource, depending on what issues and where you want to go for best practices.
Sure. So if you're a director and you're told to kind of bone up a little bit on sustainability as it pertains to your directorship, you go to that chapter.
That's right.
And you got a good 20-25 pages on
exactly.
That. Yeah. For those the viewers, we have a special discount that Richard and the publisher have been generous enough to share with us. If you go to wiley.com, WILEY.com, you can purchase Richard's book at a 30% discount using the code HBG30. So HBG30, and that's valid through the end of the year. So I encourage you all to do that. And Richard tells me it's selling very well these days with governance professionals and directors in particular. So when you were putting this together, and I know it took you a couple of years, what surprised you most, when you're kind of compiling it all?
I didn't want a book of academics. I wanted a book of practitioners. So I started out with probably 80 or 90 potential authors, and then I narrowed it down. And I was really ruthless in terms of the quality of the work. And I wanted to reach out to people that had never written before, but were institutional shareholders, activists, compensation consultants, lawyers, and also people that had written before, people that had a high Twitter following, were experts in the field. And then I began going back and forth and editing and positioning their chapters for them. And I gave them carte blanche. I said, listen, be critical. Don't feel as though you have to represent the status quo. This field is changing. I've seen more changes in the last couple of years in the field of corporate governance than probably the last 20 or 30. So I wanted people to be constructively critical and to also look forward and say what's going to happen in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. What should be on directors' radar screens? So I've got I think a pretty good deck of people that are critical and are forward-looking. And I said, if it's not new, then don't put it in the book. So I think it's a pretty good book. As you said, it's been selling. I think we're almost at 3,000. I'd like to do 5,000 copies by early 2017. The good news is that directors are buying it. Boards are buying it. It's probably a little expensive for academics, but I'm able to give a discount to my academic colleagues. So yeah, it's doing well.
Good. Well, yeah, I think you've definitely achieved your goal in terms of having various viewpoints represented. In reading this book, it's clearly not written as a textbook, which is just purely factual. You have people taking some pretty controversial positions at times, and you've got a chapter written by Nell Minow, one written by Bob Monks. These are not people who hold back their opinions.
Correct.
But they're very important. They have been very important thinkers over the years. So it's yeah. So some of what's in here might surprise you as being somewhat non-traditional. When I read this book, and even just reading the opening table of contents, I find this absolutely overwhelming in terms of how much a director either should or could know about this subject of corporate governance, and the awesome responsibility that comes with that. One of the writers in here they talk about corporations having power and influence on par with sovereign nations. Talk about how corporations really are going to be the ones to help, or the ones who will solve global problems.
Yeah, that's right. And
I'm reading this, I'm like, wow, that is those are pretty strong statements, but in a lot of ways they're true. So other people have said this before. So how is any individual supposed to go into this job understanding the kind of expectations of, essentially you need today be an expert in everything like sustainability and tech and, who knows, blockchain technology. And so, how does someone go into this job and really, take on this responsibility?
You can't. That's the short answer. We are moving from generalists to expert boards. So you cannot be an expert in everything. I think the key is to have, the average board, 7 to 11 to 13 people. You formulate a matrix and you find out, given the business that you're in, given the strategy, given the management team, what areas of expertise do we need on this board? And the more expert you are in something, the less expertise you may have in something else, and that's completely fine. I think on balance, though, if you look at all the various chapters, if you've got the areas of expertise covered off, you mentioned a few, cybersecurity, for example, is becoming the new financial literacy. You've got to have a base level understanding of social media, of bring your own device, of technology. You don't have to be an expert, but you have to have some familiarity with information technology. And then you might have, depending on what business you're in, if you're in financial services or insurance, you might have a director that has got more expertise than you. So I think what you're saying, Doug, is that the awesome obligations now that are on corporate directors, the average board position, regardless of the size of company, is some 300 hours a year. So the risks have gotten greater, the time investment has gotten greater, the need for education has gotten greater. So it used to be you could be a former executive, you have a general good business understanding, but the best boards in the world now are looking at individual areas of expertise, and the book tried to mimic that.
Yeah, and I noticed, in the chapter you wrote a lot about independence. I think you talked about how qualifications, CEO and experience, those are not actual qualifications. They might be descriptors. And so, so talk a little bit more about that in terms of qualifications for being on a board.
Well, it used to be the qualification was minimal. I think we were talking earlier about over 18, not bankrupt and not found to be insane by a judge. Those qualifications are pretty minimalist. So in the last 3, 4, 5 years, we've just gotten, you've now got various areas of expertise. You've got, and notice expertise and competency. It's not that I was a CEO, or I have experience. Experience is great, but what regulators tend to look at are competencies, skills, knowledge, experience, education, and training. And that degree of competency can go up or down. So, for example, if one of the requirements for a board is cybersecurity, we were just talking about, if that cybersecurity expert doesn't keep current, that area of expertise will go down. Someone can acquire cybersecurity expertise by self-study, by going to conferences, by educating. So having a matrix that qualifies and quantifies what skills your colleagues have is the way to go. And in the United States, as of 2009, American boards are now recruiting on the basis of these what's known as competencies.
Sure. Some disclosing them, some kind of keeping it behind the scenes. So I guess is there still room for the generalist board member? Because what you're describing sounds like kind of a more or less a collection of specialists.
Yes, I mean you would have, what you should have at a minimum is knowledge of the business. I think regulators went offside, starting with Sarbanes-Oxley in 2001, 2002. They really wanted independent directors. And what happens there is you get an independent director with generalist experience, but they might not understand the business. When I do evaluations of the board, the management team, the number one critique that the management team has is that the independent directors don't understand the business. So you can be independent and you can be a generalist, but you really have to learn the business. So if whatever business you're in, the rail industry, the consumer products, retail, you really have to. And if you're independent, so you're not from the industry, your first 2-3 years are really learning the business, understanding the revenue model, understanding estimates, judgments, financial statements. So independent directors without that industry expertise they have a bit of a learning curve.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. One thing that we see these days, especially in the media, is this phenomenon where anytime something bad happens at a company and it gets reported about, the question comes up, well, where was the board? The board must have been asleep. And without naming companies, what always interests me is these companies where, whatever the problem was, happened at the middle level of the organization or further down in the organization. There was no wrongdoing at the senior executive level. And I always wondered, well, geez, how do the executives and then the board, how are they able to identify those types of things early and try to remediate them? Or is it pretty much impossible and they really just have to react to the crisis after it develops?
Well, there's two schools of thought on that. The one school of thought is, listen, there's nothing we can do, Richard, that would oversee, at the 10 levels into the organization, it was a rogue employee. There's nothing that the board could have done. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing that we should be expected to do because this is a large company. It's got 30, 40, 50,000 employees. We can't be babysitting everybody. That's a legitimate point of view.
Sure.
The counterpoint to that is when I go in after a disaster and I question the board and I question the management team, typically what I find is that bad news in the organization didn't rise.
Yes.
And there was bullying, there was toxicity, there was sexual misconduct, there was fraud, and the board didn't insist on the proper reporting. They didn't recognize the red flags, or they recognized the red flags and they didn't act on the red flags. So at some point, that first school of thought can lead you to a sense of complacency where you just claim that there's very little you can do. The best boards actually have systems in place so that tone at the bottom, tone in the middle, that rises, and that comes to the board. So boards, the one thing they don't like is surprises, so that the boards are not the last to know, and bad news rises within the organization. So good boards are questioning more. They're insisting on independent functions within the company, reporting directly to the board, the risk function, internal audit, compliance, for example, and they're proactive. I think this first school of thought can lead you to a sense of complacency. You might legitimately be in the second school of thought and still miss it, which is fine. But at least you're not you have not gone passive. You're doing what you should be doing. So the reporting relationships now for boards and their oversight of management is changing. It used to be that if you're the CEO, Doug, and I'm the board, I would not have a line of sight to anybody. But now I'm asking for risk takers. I'm asking for employee surveys. Boards have become more aggressive, more assertive, and management has to just adapt to that. So I guess what I'm saying is the better boards are going beyond the CEO. They're inviting people to meetings. They're going on tours. They want bad news to rise. They're looking at culture surveys. They're looking at auditing of reputation risk. They're becoming more assertive than they were even 5 years ago.
Yeah. So basically, the best boards kind of think proactively, and they think about, okay, what can we do to try to capture that without being necessarily told, okay, this is kind of, the cookbook, or these are the legal requirements that you have to fulfill.
Or running the company.
Yeah.
Like management
exactly.
you don't want to be too aggressive. It's a fine line between, where governance ends and where management starts. If you're too, you want, clearly the line has gone down, but good directors will be always careful never to go beyond the line. And management will understand that their role is to oversee. It's not to manage. It's not to direct. So this is as much an intelligence gathering exercise as what I'm suggesting is that active boards are not running the company, and they should never cross that line.
And so, I look at, despite the two schools of thought, stuff is still, bad things are still going to happen at corporations. Mm-hmm. And, people ask me about this, and they say, well, if something bad happens, shouldn't the directors be accountable? I say, yes, but to a certain degree, the law protects them. There's they have their fiduciary duties.
Right.
They fulfill their fiduciary duties. They're still protected that if they went through, if they did all the proper things and something bad still happened, that's business. Things like that will happen, or you make some decisions that look good at the time, mm-hmm. and they just don't pan out the way you thought they would. There are folks now who want to basically say that's too protective, mm-hmm. of a director, and we want directors to be held accountable. We want their pay to be tied to these mishaps. And, I've heard recently in Congress people saying, you know what, you should go to jail. I want you criminally investigated. Yeah. We're not going to have better corporate governance until we start throwing senior executives and maybe directors behind bars. Yeah. So how do you deal with that? That
is the third school of thought. That's a more aggressive school of thought, namely that, listen, this happened on your watch. Your responsibility is to oversee management. It's to exercise your fiduciary duty. You are hiding behind the business judgment rule, and at some point, as we move. Here's the point: is if we move towards greater time, greater risks, greater expertise, greater oversight of management, at some point, boards have to step up and take responsibility, and that could include, not being insulated from the business judgment rule, not being protected by, directors and officers insurance. This most aggressive school of thought is, listen, Iceland, for example, has sent several executives, including directors, to jail. Other countries have. Elizabeth Warren comes to mind, who's probably the most vocal in this left of center school of thought, which is, directors shouldn't get off scot-free. These are not her words, but I think they accurately portray her point of view. Directors should not be able to be insulated behind process. They should actually suffer, as should executives, when conscious decisions were made to turn a blind eye or not to follow up on your duty of care, not to ask the right questions. So there's a scrutiny now on boards, and that's putting a lot of pressure on boards to want to never be in the spotlight in terms of reputation risk. So it's really challenging now to be a good corporate director. So we have media scrutiny, we have activism. It's got the playing field is tilting towards this school of thought that you're paid, for the most part, a good amount of money. Your responsibilities are onerous, and the buck has to stop at the board. Boards have incredible power, and normally when something goes wrong, right, the finger is pointed at the boards and say, where were you? And that's a legitimate point of view. So that's not going away anytime soon. If anything, it might get worse.
Yeah. Clearly, there's there's definitely, you see a rush to judgment. Politicians definitely getting into the act, including presidential candidates commenting about these types of things. From a legal standpoint, obviously, a lot of what we talk about, at least in the United States, is really based on Delaware law.
Correct.
In Canada, how do you, is there any kind of meaningful differentiation between how these types of, the business judgment rule equivalent in Canada, that and what Delaware law prescribes?
Our legal systems are relatively similar. There are some differences. We tend to have principles and practices in Canada as opposed to rules. We do not have a national securities body like the Americans do. We tend to have provincial securities body. We don't have the volume of case law and of regulation that the Americans have. We have a very well-developed financial services sector, energy sector, corporate governance. I think we're one of the few countries that has not had a bailout of a financial institution after the financial crisis. I think also culturally in Canada, we're a little more conservative than many American boards that I observe. I think you had mentioned earlier that you can tell when there's an American on a Canadian board, and I can tell that as well, is that I use this as an example. The American director would tell the CEO which way to part his or her hair. Canadians are a little more reserved. I think we get to the same point, but Canadians tend to be a little more, probably too much, a little more consensus oriented. And I think the nice thing about having that counterpoint on a board is it can move everybody forward. But for the most part, our legal regimes are fairly similar. We do not have as well developed of a plaintiff's bar in Canada as we do in the United States. So there are differences, but I think both countries are relatively similar because we are, our largest trading partners with the United States. We've got a lot of cross-listed companies in the U.S. There tends to be a sort of convergence of corporate governance standards, which is probably a good thing.
Sure. When you were talking about directors feeling the pressure and not wanting to have, if you follow this school of thought of the people who think corporate executives should go to jail for their actions if they turn out badly, does that, do you worry about that stifling risk-taking and innovation and all the arguments that you hear from kind of the free market types? There's that argument that it would stifle risk-taking. It also would stifle the directors pool that are the assertions made that its government has gone overboard. They should respect the free market. I appreciate that point of view. The counterpoint to that is that, listen, directors select themselves. For the most part, they're a homogenous group. They're not very diverse. I think some 50% of Canadian companies don't have a single woman on the board. There's a lot of respect that comes. They're highly paid positions. Regulators now are looking at this and saying, listen, we should be a little more active here in terms of targeting these types of boards. So some 49 countries are now going right into boardrooms, and they're saying you've got potential the Bribery Act in the UK, you've got competencies that we want diversification of corporate boards, we want shareholders to have a say in terms of who sits on these boards. These are all direct consequences of bad apples, yes, and you get almost on a monthly basis, you get examples of companies where there was compliance failure. So the consequences of this is that the scrutiny will happen, and regulators and politicians can't not act, right? And they tend to overcompensate. When they do act, they tend to actually, there's laws of unintended consequences, they tend to actually make it worse in terms of being too risk averse and pursuing opportunity. So I see both sides to that, but I think that the pendulum has swung, and it happens after every crisis. The difference between 2008 and 2001 is very different.
2001, Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, they were largely implosions at those specific companies. 2008 was very different. It was a systemic global phenomenon, and the aggressiveness of regulators I could never have predicted. I mean, regulators now, they're interviewing directors, they're asking for matrices. Shareholders are coming to the table. They say, we want proxy access. We want to be able to tell boards and management teams who should be at the boardroom table. I never would have been able to predict that in 2008. So the pendulum is changing, absolutely.
So, I mean, one thing that you talk about is, these matrices, competency matrices for selecting directors. And I guess, you've seen examples where governments are essentially writing the matrix and imposing it on companies and asking them to disclose it. Are they consulting with anybody like yourself about these types of things?
I tend to help, but for the most part, they have industry groups, stakeholder groups. You don't want that. You don't want a regulator telling you to put 30% women on your board. You don't want a regulator saying, here are the competencies you should be putting on your board. You want the governance industry, management, directors, they should be doing this. But here's what has happened is they don't do it, right? And they don't react to what's happening around them. They refuse to implement best practices, and then regulators progressively tighten. And they come in and they say, you know what, we're actually going to prompt you a little bit. We're going to, and term limits, for example, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, India, the UK, they're all going to 9 years, 10 years, and then you're off the board. And then directors say, well, hang on a second here, you're actually, this is too much, but I think it's incumbent on industry to learn with the times and adapt and improve, because if they don't, regulators have proven that they have a regulatory appetite and they will step in and they tend to actually make it worse. They tend to pick numbers. We want a certain portion of women. We want term limits of 9 years. You shouldn't be over 3 boards. Regulators don't come in and assess boards. They tend to land on a number, and most of the time, that's what they do. They come in with a number, and that's what has unintended consequences. So if you want to forestall regulation, it's important to be responsive to what the changes that are happening and not sort of thumb the regulator, which is what many companies do, is they just refuse to do it. Yeah. And then it gets worse.
Yeah. Yeah. And so for the types of things that you were talking about, the tech coming up with these one-size-fits-all approaches, after 9 years you have to leave the board, or after 9 years you're no longer independent. Some would argue, though, on the disclosure front, having the government prescribe things is actually a good thing, because the companies won't do it on their own, or if the companies do it on their own, you have so many different ways of disclosing things that it's not comparable across companies. So then it's not helpful. And if you had one standard, I think the sustainability folks would love to have actual kind of line items in the 10K, because it's comparable. You do, XBRL and all that stuff.
Yes.
So what do you, how do you look at that?
Well, that's an advantage. When a regulator comes in with a standard, everybody moves towards it. And directors have told me it's helpful, because if you're in a boardroom, I'm actually suggesting to my colleagues, as an example, that we need to move forward. And unless there's a regulation I can point to, it just doesn't get done. A board is like a family. So 1, 2, 3 directors, and then naysayers say, well, we don't really need to do this. It's not obligatory. So once the rule comes in, it becomes very quickly. Sustainability is a good example. The movement towards climate change, the Paris Accord, the entire industry will converge, and you'll start to develop mature standards, assurance, some greater certainty around some of these, ESG metrics. So that's an advantage of coming in with regulation, is that everybody has to do it, and there's no discretion, and there's no potential for gaming or manipulative disclosure. You have to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we've seen in the COP area, even though you have this required disclosure, you still have arguments in terms of whether the numbers that you're putting in there are the real numbers, are they meaningful numbers, et cetera. So, in terms of kind of government action versus private ordering, whatever you want to call it, industry solutions, some countries have moved to some kind of a code a corporate governance code.
Yes.
That's a kind of a national thing. It might not be, it's maybe endorsed by the government or by the regulators, but it's not created by them. So I guess talk about a little bit about kind of the experience in Canada about, developing a code and, the different kind of waves and schools of thought on a corporate governance code nationwide.
Our code started with Peter Day in 1994, and he developed the Day Commission, and they developed a series of guidelines that have been progressively updated. And that was a good thing because that forestalled regulation. It's always better. South Africa has done this with King 3, King 4 that just came out. The United Kingdom has done this. It's all, and in America, there was a group of investors and CEOs, I think it was the Common Sense Governance Principles that I read that was just terrific. So it's good to get together as an industry, as a group, and have convergence and have the major stakeholders bring investors in as part of the equation, which this group did, and say, listen, let's come. We know the world is changing. Let's draft a code, principles and practices that's not prescriptive, right? But clearly it's saying you need to do certain things. And we have in Canada comply or explain. Many countries do. It doesn't have to be comply or explain. The point is to be flexible, to say, listen, here's best practices. Let's create a regime that we can all buy into. We can all sign it, and companies can use it. Companies can literally cut and paste and say, here's what we're going to do. And numerous countries have done that, and probably a dozen, including Canada. And that was a good thing because it said to the community, listen, we're responsible. We're going to take it seriously. We understand the world is changing, and you get buy-in. You get buy-in from industry much quicker because the people that develop the code are the actual industry participants, as opposed to a regulator coming in. And regulators tend to miss the mark. It's always better if industry self-generates. So this American code that came out about 3 or 4 months ago, I just thought it was terrific, and I think that we should see more of that.
And so, but who was Peter Day?
Peter Day he's called the godfather of corporate governance. These are called the Day Guidelines, and there were some 24 guidelines that were, he put together a committee with CEOs and directors and investors, and they called, it was the TSX Guidelines, Toronto Stock Exchange Guidelines for Corporate Governance. This came out in 1994, and it's been updated a number of times, but it was the foresight of a group of people some 20 years ago that said, listen, let's lead the field here, and so that has resulted in better corporate governance in Canada and less of a need for regulators to come forward.
So he was just a private citizen.
Correct.
And then it sounds like the
stock exchange adopted it.
They adopted it.
That's right.
Okay,
that's something else that can happen is the regulator says, listen, this is important. Let's put our regulatory stamp on it. So if it's done well, the regulators will want to participate in that. Regulators don't like, for the most part, regulating. They like industry to do it because then they can see the progress.
Yeah. And so I guess in the UK there was the Lord Davies Commission where their code started, and again kind of you had some government actor involved. So I mean in the United States, I think there have been several attempts to create this kind of a code, Common Sense Corporate Governance Principles being the latest. NACD tried it. The Conference Board came out with something, that tried to encourage companies to adopt it, and some actually, reference it in their proxy materials. But it never really, these things never really took off. So, it sounds like it would require someone like the SEC to come in and
bring the fragmented groups together and have a pan code that everybody can partake in. Yeah, you need some regulatory leadership to bring everybody on board as opposed to the fragmented, because you're all part of the same equation. So everybody has a vested interest in a uniform set of principles. So I think having regulatory participation at the front end would help to leapfrog, to get these groups together.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it sounds and leadership, like you said,
right.
You need one or a couple, very strong individuals to kind of, by the courage of their convictions, push this all the way through. One thing that we're looking at in the United States these days is that is likely to be mandated soon is this universal proxy card for proxy fights. The SEC just came out with a proposed rule.
Yep.
This was something that, Conference Board was involved in some discussions with industry groups trying to see, well, can we come up with an industry solution? SEC basically kind of took it out of everyone's hands and said, no, we're going to impose something. Some of what they looked at is based on experiences in Canada with universal proxies in maybe half a dozen proxy fights recently where universal proxy was used. So talk a little bit about kind of that experience and what you saw from those.
For the most part, it's been positive. The most famous example is Canadian Pacific, where Bill Ackman had a universal proxy card was used. Maybe we should define what that is.
Sure.
Typically, you have a dissident shareholder proposing a slate, so it's like a form, and then the management team will propose a proxy circular. So you have groups of directors proposed by management and groups of directors proposed by the shareholder. What the SEC is saying is, listen, let's give one form. So we take the dissident directors being proposed and the management directors, they're the directors proposed by management, we put it on one form. And in Canada, the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance, which is our large umbrella group of institutional shareholders, they were prescriptive and they said, listen, you shouldn't give anybody else primacy or preference. You should have a group of directors, almost in alphabetical order, with a short bio for each. And let's say it's 13, choose 10. And then shareholders will, at the annual meeting or on their proxy circular, they would actually receive the card. They would receive one card, not a dissident card, because if you receive a dissident card and a management card, it's confusing. So listen, let's have a universal proxy card where we have all the directors in alphabetical order. We have management directors and we have shareholder directors. And we as shareholders will select, we'll vote our shares and we'll select the top 10 out of 13. That's been very positive. And I think that it says to the management team, listen, you can't sort of outmaneuver the shareholders. Shareholders have as much of a right to propose directors. Let's put everybody together and not have this expensive proxy battle with a dissident slate, and let's put it all in one. So I think this is the future where you've got multiple directors and you've got votes. So I think that the experience in Canada has been very positive.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the fundamental issue that they're trying to solve is this inability to mix and match.
Yeah.
So you're either voting for these 12 folks or these 12 folks, and you can't say, well, I like 10 of these guys, and then there are 2 women over here that I would really want to vote for them. You can't do that unless you show up at the annual meeting. Then you can do it.
Yeah. So
otherwise you can't.
There's procedural impediments to be able to say I like these, but I also like these. So the best thing is to converge.
Sure.
So the experience in Canada has been positive. I think this is the future. There's always an inherent aversion when you have a Team A and Team B. And what the regulator now is saying is, listen, let's have Team A and Team B and pick your best team. That, in a sports analogy, seems to be completely reasonable. So I commend the SEC for doing that.
Sure. And so, I guess in terms of people who are kind of not in favor of this, couple arguments that they raise. One is law of unintended consequences, and maybe it's too early to see what that is. And then also the argument is, well, this is just going to lead to more proxy fights. It's going to encourage the activists, and is that really what we want? Does it? I guess those are two questions.
Yeah.
Do you see it leading to more
proxy
fights? And is that a good thing?
I'll tell you, it's going to get worse. Activists will come and will say, I want to use the universal proxy card, and let's just extend that analogy, extend that argument. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. Proxy access is going to come to Canada. Some 30% of American companies already have proxy access in the form of private ordering. The universal proxy is the vehicle to enable this. So yeah, it's going to happen, and there may be unintended consequences. We can always tweak it. It might encourage activism, yes, activism is not necessarily a bad thing. I think you have activist situations when boards aren't doing their jobs. It certainly will put the heat on directors. We have a law that just is about to be changed in Canada, majority voting, right? You can vote for, you can vote against, or you can abstain. So we now have an against vote, and we have a requirement coming in Canada that every director has to receive 50+1% of the votes that are eligible to vote at the general meeting. So clearly, regulators now, and this is back to our original discussion, regulators are tipping the balance in favor of shareholders at the end of the day. Now, management might be averse to that, but it's happening. It's happening whether you like it or not. So proxy access, majority voting, universal proxy card. I never would have predicted 2-3 years ago that this is happening. I think what regulators are saying is we want shareholder accountability. We want shareholders to have some say, and management has resources at their disposal. They can block. They've got legal resources. So the regulator is trying to create an equal playing field between shareholders and boards.
Got it.
That's not necessary. That's a advocacy point of view, but it's just there's just to represent the shareholder side. Management is clearly, many managers would be averse to this. The other argument, which you didn't mention, is special purpose directors. We might have rogue directors that want to get onto the proxy, but I think for the most part, shareholders are responsible people, and many of the directors that were put forward were actually better than the existing slate. In the CP case, Canadian Pacific, Bill Ackman's directors were I think far superior to the. So this puts the heat on directors to really bring your A game.
Got it. Let's see. A couple years ago, you and I talked about technology. We actually talked about technology through Twitter before even meeting each other face to face, and we talked about what impact has technology had on corporate governance, and specifically, what happens in the boardroom. We've seen a lot of innovations these days in terms of how people communicate, how investors, how companies communicate with their investors, how board members prepare. What have what are your observations in terms of the effect that technology might have had on corporate governance over the last few years? Oh,
it's been a complete sea change. Most directors now are not as averse to LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. Their kids are on it, their grandkids are on it. They're learning it. I am in paperless board meetings. You're anomalous now. If you're a board and you're not using a board portal, then something's wrong. I'm in boardrooms right now where you've got iPads in front of you. I'm in boardrooms where you've actually got technology and you've got video terminals of other directors in other jurisdictions that are simultaneously being patched in. You're not using that clunky phone in the middle of the table. So you can recruit directors from Asia, from Europe, from India, from China in real time. So what technology's done is it's really it's facilitated the flow of information to directors in a very meaningful way. It's become harder for directors to push back and be a Luddite and say, I just want paper. It's really transformed. It's put pressure on boards. It's also brought younger directors to the table, directors in their 40s and 50s. Many directors in their 60s and early 70s have not grown up with technology. So it puts pressure on everybody to sort of be leading edge. It's opened, shareholder engagement. I predict, Doug, that we might see in the next 3, 4, 5 years AGMs that are online, we're starting to see it right now. We're hybrid. You might be able to vote, if you're a shareholder, to vote for your directors using an online portal. So it's really, it's opened up the market. It's brought new directors to the table. I think overall it's become a good thing. There's also the negative side, which is cybersecurity, hacking. It's directors, for the most part, they're catching up, but they're still not. You'll never be as good as potential hackers. There's Russia, there's Al Qaeda, there's China, where you have nation states that are even potentially participating in this. So you really have to, as a director, understand technology and be able to make sure that your crown jewels within the company aren't exposed. So technology now is becoming, it's definitely inside the boardroom. Directors are asking tough questions. They're learning, which is a good thing. Many boards are bringing on cyber expertise, so it's really transformed. Technology is becoming the new financial literacy for directors. Yeah.
Interesting. And we actually have on our blog, the Governance Center blog, a guy by the name of Bob Zukas, who wrote a chapter in your book.
That's right.
He wrote a blog piece saying that, maybe at some point cybersecurity experts will almost be like the audit committee financial expert, and every board essentially, either we'll have one or we'll have to explain, how do they fulfill that kind of expertise.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that you see it going in that direction.
I rarely see a matrix that doesn't have technology on it now.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's becoming an essential for boardrooms. Yeah.
Yeah. And cybersecurity, obviously, I guess I can't think of a company that would not be affected by some kind of cybersecurity breach.
Agreed.
One interesting thing in terms of directors using technology and kind of the awareness about cybersecurity is, there was I guess it was Colin Powell's emails were hacked, and he's a director on public companies, and there was a kind of a target list of acquisition targets for that company that was revealed through WikiLeaks.
That's right. Email is a very risk for the use of directors. You could inadvertently send confidential information out. You should, and this is to directors out there, you should be using a secure board portal. Diligent, BoardVantage, these are two reputable companies. But the use of a board portal has got cybersecurity protections embedded in the board portal, so it's always a good thing. Email, directors should not be communicating by email.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes it's all too easy for companies or directors to forget about that. And they say, all right, well, I'll just send you the draft by email.
Right.
Those are words that, should make you shudder if you counsel boards. Since your book is very comprehensive, you also talk about different forms of corporations, not just, we spent so much time in corporate governance talking about the largest, mega cap companies and activism and shareholder proposals. The fact is that most companies don't face that kind of stuff. And so, you talk about private companies, closely held, family owned, not-for-profit, startups, and in this election, actually, some of the real interesting stuff has happened around, the candidates' foundations or their own, companies that are basically controlled by their own family. So, what are some of the insights from these chapters that talk about these different forms of organizations?
Well, I wanted the book to include those because every organization has to have a board. And when you look at the surveys of state-owned enterprises, not-for-profit, private companies, they all have boards. And they all have a strategy. They all have risk. They all have to pay executives. They all have the similar sorts of dynamics. When you look at the surveys that come out, CEO succession planning, what's of cybersecurity, for example. So I wanted subject matter experts to come to the table and say, listen, look at the rest of the chapters and then write a chapter for me that how is this different, if at all? And I'll tell you, when you look at, and they are different, but many issues are not. At some point, a board is a board, whether it's a charitable foundation, a university, a hospital, a family business, they all struggle with similar issues. It's not the same, clearly. So I said, listen, tell me what the differences are for the reader, and then integrate with the other chapters to be able to sort of link so that if you're on a not-for-profit board, and many directors are on not-for-profit boards, they're also on state-owned enterprises in Canada, we call them crown boards, hospitals, etc. And many of the directors that are becoming into the pipeline, they start on a not-for-profit board. So I wanted the book to have best practices for not just public companies, financial institutions, but also these other types of forms. So for the most part, the issues are similar, but they're different. And the authors in these various chapters are subject matter experts in that particular domain. So I think that was a good addition to the book. I'm really glad I did that.
Yeah, I think that you've done people a great service there because so many of the companies fall into that cap. Well, they fall out of the mega cap company definition, and you're right. The directors on companies they participate in these types of boards, and just seeing a couple not-for-profit boards, they're fraught with governance issues at that level. It's really amazing. Let's go back and talk a little bit more about director independence, which is something that you're very passionate about. You're passionate about a lot of things, but this one as well. And so you talked about how industry expertise is really lacking on a lot of boards, and maybe the United States has swung the pendulum too much. So independence really means that you're only getting people. You can't get anyone from the from the industry of that company. But companies, they also have their reasoning for not having other industry folks. They say, well, this person, they come from a competitor,
right?
Or they're on the board of a competitor, or there's the Clayton Act, the Williams Act, there's antitrust issues, and then there's kind of the personal issue of, well, the CEO doesn't really want some former CEO of another company looking over his or her shoulder, kind of second guessing, and maybe the board says, all right, we're going to fire you and put this person in there. So, how do you reconcile those types of arguments coming back from the companies?
The primacy given to independence is a regulatory focus. Most regulators all over the world want independent directors because independent directors they don't have ties to management, they don't have ties to the company, they're more able to oversee. Even Japan is starting to have independent directors onto the board. So I'm not saying independence is a bad thing. I'm saying you want independent directors, but you also want some industry expertise. And also you want independent directors that have independence of mind. You can be formally independent, but if you've gone to school together, you're a member of the same clubs, you're personal friends. I'm seeing a board right now where they go out to sporting events on a regular basis, the board and the management team. That's probably not a good thing. Management. So in other words, you want independent, objective directors. You don't want sort of an office at the company. You don't want sort of gifts. I've heard vacations, interlocks, excessively long tenure. These are some sort of red flags that you may not have the independence that you claim to have, having gone to school together. So we're seeing more of a focus on objective independence, of independence of mind, not necessarily regulatory independence. You can be independent, but you can be completely captured by management. So that's not good. We want independent directors who have independence of mind.
But how do you measure that?
The only way to measure it is by the board. The board has to measure it. The board should do annually an independence review of its directors. Directors know who is not independent. And in the UK, for example, they've said, listen, this is so important. We're going to have, every 2 or 3 years, we're going to have a facilitator come in and help you. It shouldn't be the board judging the board, but every 2 or 3 years, it's almost like an audit, right? Yeah. Someone will come in and you'll be able to disclose confidentially who on the board you think is not independent. If a non-executive chair or a committee chair is not independent, that's a problem. That board will not be effective. So independence is really, really important, but it's important to be measured properly to capture some of these social issues that can undermine independence.
So I guess, obviously the problem here is you're asking people to implement this best practice, and the people you're asking to implement
it might affect them.
Well, it's like they're all the buddies. So I don't see any problem here. They all look independent to me.
Never have an argument with someone whose vested interest is dependent on not winning the argument.
Yes.
You're right. You're preaching to the converted.
Let's take a vote of whether we're independent. Yes. Okay. Done.
That's
recorded in the minutes.
That's right. Everybody is a collective. So you really need that objective point of view, which is an outsider, a shareholder, that second. Otherwise, you're assessing your own work. The analogy would be if my students mark their own exams. At some point, you need someone to assess the independence.
Yeah, you don't trust the honor code that much.
No.
And you yourself get hired by boards to do this kind of assessment or audit.
Yeah, that's right.
And then the trick is, what happens afterwards? Do they actually implement?
With my assessments, I will recommend that directors resign from boards. I mean, you get the assessment back and you have to deliver negative advice. So there's not a single board. I probably assessed dozens of boards, but there's not a single board, even great publicly traded companies, where there's at least not one or two directors that
Sure.
is in need of some coaching, or in the view of other directors, they should not be on the board.
Sure.
So, so having an objective assessment every 2 or 3 years is probably a good thing. The UK went to this. Other regulators are going to this as well. Otherwise, it becomes an annual agreement, right?
And the kind of third party observer, is that someone who's certified, or how do you have independence of those folks?
Yeah, you need some standards for governance advisors, and also for compensation consultants, and also for internal auditors. You need people who are advising boards need themselves to have. If we're insisting on this, we should hold ourselves responsible as well. So regulators are looking at the people who advise boards and making sure that they're independent and they're properly qualified, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, so in the States right now, we have a huge regime around the independence of registered public accounting firms.
Right.
There is kind of a de facto independent standard for compensation consultants, and so, but soon we're going to have for board assessment
for legal
experts, for cybersecurity experts,
investment bankers.
Yeah.
Increasingly, as these people be brought into advise boards, they should have independence and qualification standards as well.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of change when you think about it.
Yeah. So definitely a lot of change. Going forward, when you write kind of volume 2 of this, or the kind of the update.
I'm talking to the publisher about a second volume, by the way, which is good.
Well, so say fast forward 10 or 15 years, and you're redoing this book, you're adding to it. What do you think are some of the chapters or the chapter titles that aren't in here right now that may be chapters in the future version?
The future, and it's probably not 10 or 15 years, it's probably 3 or 4 years. I'd like to have the second edition in the next 2, 3, 4 years, is non-financial. It's safety, health, cybersecurity, climate change, political donations, military, continued focus on independence, behaviors on boards. But it's really it's connecting. And Doug Park, by the way, had a chapter in here on connecting non-financial performance and risks with pay and with governance. That is probably about 3 or 4 chapters in the book. The next book, that will be probably half the book. So that's the future. The future is really climate change and maturity of those metrics, the inability to manipulate, integrated reporting, focus on Paris. Depending on what happens with the American election, climate change certainly will. There's been accords with India. We've had Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. has signed an accord for renewable energy by 2025. I think Hillary Clinton wants 50% renewables by 2030. So I think that's the future, and the role of boards in overseeing all of this. I'm already starting to see it now. I'm seeing climate change expertise on energy company boards. We have a huge change in Canada. We've got progressive governments. We've got a new prime minister that is committed to implementing the Paris Accord. So I think that this will be the future for the next edition.
Great. Well, we have our work cut out for us, don't we? Well, Richard, thanks a lot for coming in. I really appreciate it. Everybody, the handbook for for board governance. Again, the discount code is HBG30. If you go to wiley.com, you can get this wonderful book for 30% off through the end of 2016. I want to thank Richard again.
My pleasure.
Hope you follow him on Twitter at Dr. Leblanc.
Right.
And join his LinkedIn group, Boards and Advisors, which just exploded. I think you have over 20,000 members now. That's incredible. And of course, follow the Conference Board on Twitter, TCB Corp Gov, and we also have a LinkedIn page. So everyone, thanks again for tuning in to this special edition of Governance Watch, and we will see you next time.
Great. Thanks, Doug.